This is a show about communication, about getting your message across, about connecting with people, whether you're in a two-person meeting or presenting on stage to hundreds of people. The scale of it doesn't matter, the aims are the same. I'm Maryanne Johnston, and I help clients to present their ideas with a clear and confident delivery. I also help them to prepare and create a structure for their content so it's engaging and memorable for their audience. And critically, I ensure they're using their relaxed conversational style at all times. Communication is rarely straightforward, and we may be facing many different listeners in different environments on a daily basis. And how we feel during those interactions may also vary on a daily basis. This show is all about learning the skills and techniques to enable you to be agile in the way you handle these interactions as you move around your daily life. In this season, we're discussing conflict and how to resolve it, and I'm delighted to be joined by Drew Drummond. Drew is the Managing Director of Drummond International, an award-winning Edinburgh-based leadership consultancy helping individuals and organisations to navigate change, build culture, and resolve conflict. He's a highly regarded, accredited mediator, and Drew empowers teams through storytelling and lived experiences across diverse sectors. His experience spans from the corporate sector, supporting a range of different executives and teams and leadership development, to the not-for-profit sector with Columba 1400, and the public sector, working with a number of local authorities across Scotland. First and foremost, though, he's a family man. Drew describes himself as a good dad and admits he's only considered putting his 3 beautiful children on eBay twice. Drew, thanks so much for joining me. I've been really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Maryanne. I'm delighted to have this opportunity, and very rarely do we have conflict and communication in the same hand, but how important that is, and really looking forward to really just getting into a deeper tissue conversation than how's the weather on what we might be looking at.
So in the last episode, Drew, we were chatting about what conflict is, and we talked about different examples of what it might look like for different people. Something I wanted to actually go to before we talk about strategies for handling it is actually prevention. Is there a way of preventing conflict, do you think?
That's a great question, Maryanne. We're sort of got to be very, very careful in that by the word prevention, it suggests that conflict is a bad thing that should be avoided. And I think there is a place where it's pretty hard to live in today's society without conflict presenting itself in some shape or form, whether you own that, whether you're part of that, or whether that's the way someone else behaves. And from last episode, I've said very clearly, the only thing we can do is control our behavior. I think it's more important to recognize that conflict exists, and then it's what steps would you take to be able to try and either manage that. And part of managing something is the prevention conversation does come up. But if we rush to the prevention kind of space, I think we miss the opportunity to do the first person of being able to recognize who is it I'm actually listening to when I'm in conflict. Now, typically in the workplace, that can be the person who's at the desk next to you or the next office kind of next to you. I would be very, very wary and wanting to suggest to listeners within a workplace sort of context that I would be very careful in terms of where you're getting your signals from. Is your signal coming from the water cooler? Because it's easier to talk to them about the conflict than it is about, actually going to face it up sort of head on. Particularly in the workplace, we have these things called processes, and we have experts at being head of answers and making sure we follow the process. And I'm not giving them a doing. They're very, very important. But I do think that there are some times when a process doesn't necessarily consider the emotion that is involved with conflict, and what might we have in terms of our choosing. I think that's very, very important. And to think about that before conflict presents itself first person to you, to work out who would be my trusted other, Who would be the person that might be inside your organization, that might be outside of your organization, where you're able to go and get their perspective, someone you really value, someone that you trust and you know that has got your back. I find that very, very helpful, particularly in the work kind of place, to before working out what choices do I have to either follow a process. What I mean by that is very often people look to HR for help, and
Mhm.
HR will have a process that can be one way, one offering of help. However, got to be really, really careful that at times we would be handing over the responsibility of being involved in what the decision might be. We are handing over to HR, which would be another human being, how to navigate said conflict. And I think too often we look to the process for the answers, but have not done enough for ourselves to look at who I'm listening to, what are the choices that I have, and how might I actually be able to choose to not necessarily use my behavioral norm and maybe look at other approaches that will be uncomfortable in part, and that's part of the inner conflict. And I think it's about taking time to recognize all of that. And then I'm also now flipping over in terms of what we were talking about in the last episode, in terms of with intergenerational, in
Mm.
terms of when do we take the time before Christmas to be able to think about actually, who is it that I would take my signal from, whether this is actually a conflict?
Yeah.
I can't tell you the number of times where I've thought something's going to be a deal breaker or there's going to be a social hand grenade go off. And then the reality is often very, very different. So I
Yes.
do think that we need, in the terms of self-care, to check in, is the reality the reality? Very often I find it is not. And it's
Yes.
very easy when we're in conflict to follow the line of narrative that you believe in. And I think actually it's about being able to sort of take a breath, be able to get a bit of perspective and think about actually what do I need to do here to make sure that I'm looking after myself. And I can do that in a variety of different ways rather than trying to either address it right now, that might be later, or being able to take some time to go and talk to a trusted other, inside or outside of the family. But do the
Yeah.
preparation,
Yeah.
conflict is there, it exists.
Yeah.
So in the same way that you go and buy a new suit for work when you get your new job, if that's the kind of the protocol, I think it's really important that you also go and dust down your conflict resolution toolkit and what choices, what do I have available to me to be able to navigate, whether it be workplace, whether it be kind of intergenerational. But it's
Yeah.
so, so important that we hold on to actually your experience of this is going to help someone in a younger generation. You being able to navigate enables them. We spend so much time in today's society being defined by data. We do not spend enough time being able to look at, okay, what's the story here? And I think the more we can get open, and we're keich, forgive me if you're not in Scotland, that's a great Scottish word, which means we're rubbish. Okay. We're rubbish at being able to take the time to speak well of ourselves. And
Yeah.
even in conflict situations, when something's been handled well and you've been able to take it through steps, think how powerful, how enabling that might be for the person who could be sitting right next to you, who's feeling alone and isolated because they're being defined by the conflict that they're facing personally or professionally.
Mhm.
Really, really important that we get better at sharing stories. And that I would be
Yeah.
suggesting, if we recognize our conflict and share it, is a great prevention strategy, approach, or tool.
The reason I asked that question about preventing it is from a situation that I remember from years back. It was um a personal conflict, I'll say, rather than a workplace conflict, but not a family conflict. I ought to probably be clear about that whilst I'm talking on the podcast. But what was so fascinating, just from what you've just been talking about, it was a discussion where I definitely was picking up on signals, as you talked about, from people around me. And I was learning at the time about handling difficult conversations, actually. Coincidentally, I suppose I was learning about that. What I was learning about was this piece of focus on what you know rather than what you don't. And it was, and I, that's always stuck with me in situations after that, where it really makes you focus on the facts that are at hand of whatever the situation's in. The signals I was picking up were all the don't knows. They were assumptions, they were guesswork, they were people saying what they thought might be happening. And I remember thinking, wait a minute. And I almost sort of drew out on a piece of paper, what are the facts of this situation? Wrote down the facts. Look at all the don't knows that I've got here. I don't know any of that. They're not fact. And when it came down to making the phone call I had to make, it was basically about somebody paying a bill. It turned out there was no conflict ahead of me in the slightest. And the only reason the bill hadn't been paid was the person was on holiday. you know, and it was such a simple thing. And I remember I'd got myself really wound up about it and worried about the potential conflict. But actually, the work I did, I suppose, partly on myself and the preparation I did before I made a call, really helped me to flatten out any idea of, I felt much calmer in how I personally responded. And I think what you're saying there, I really looked after myself and thought, this is what I know about this situation. And then it allowed me to leave a voicemail and then get a response later that was, don't worry, the money will be in your account in 2 days or something. And that's the thing of realizing that I think what, as you're saying, talking, you said, you could go to the water cooler, you could be going out for coffee and you can be discussing what the conflict might be, but actually it might be unraveling into something that it's really not. So I think that's so brilliant what you're saying there about thinking about who you're talking to share whatever the problem is and being very careful in your thinking about that.
I mean, it's a leadership choice in that to ask yourself the question, am I feeling this?
Mm,
And that's something that we often miss. I would suggest, just being able to write down what is your position, what is their
yeah,
position, what is their interest, what is your interest. That whole exercise just gives a real sense of perspective
yeah,
that almost enables you to, I think, go through what, even by you sharing what you have just shared, I'm a great believer in that in any conflict situation, no one is head of answers.
no,
No one is head of answers. Okay. If we did, we wouldn't have conflict. We do have conflict. So by taking the positions, the interests, looking at this fact, is this not fact? Just how informed you are, and to make sure, because it is very easy to fuel the conflict without realizing it. And
yeah,
just, again, another Scottish word, let's carcanny, and be able to make sure that we have really thought through what I want to say here,
mm,
really thought through actually where I stand on this. Why is it important to me? And what we don't do well enough, and I really want to make sure I've talked about the life skill, is that we share our stories so other people have a how. We share our stories so other people have a how.
mm-hmm.
You have helped me in sharing how an unpaid bill. Now, it's very easy to say, and we could laugh, ha ha ha, about it, but it didn't feel like that when you were just about to press call on that phone call, did it?
No,
And
not in the
actually,
slightest.
so, what we've got to be able to recognize is the feeling, is the emotion, and the response that our bodies are having, to make sure that if we tend to that and we take care of that, we're actually more able and prepared to choose how we respond rather than react to the conflict. And I would suggest that when we're in the right now moment, we're very good about reacting to the conflict. And might we take a step back, have a bit of a breath, look at what our tools, what our strategies and approaches could be, might be. And that's where I'm very, very privileged to be able to have this as an offering with
Yeah.
Drummond International.
So let's talk about that then now. What does the toolkit look like? What are the strategies?
So I've spent a bit of, I mean, I think the best way I can describe this is, how did I get into becoming a mediator? Okay. I left university, and I'm now in my sort of, I'd like to say mid, but probably later 40s. And I'm still trying to work out what the heck it is I want to do with my life. But I found myself again and again in various different workplace situations where I was being presented with where there had been relationship breakdown. And people's behavior around that was very, very awkward. So very often the task that I was given was not the reality of what I found myself presented with.
Hmm.
And I was a bit like being thrown into the deep end of trying to find a way forward. And I think I was being asked to fix it, but actually you've got to understand it before you fix it. And I kind of, in early stages of my career, kind of was doing my best, but I was bumbling through. Okay, it wasn't until that I was offered the opportunity to attend a mediation training course that professionally the lights came on. And what it did was that it broke down kind of conflict or finding a resolution to conflict down into bite-sized chunks. Here we had a process, something that I could use at any time and be able to, rather than follow that exact process, I do not want to give you another process, but just to be able to know the different steps. And I've got to say that ever since that training program and the lights going on, whether it be personally or professionally, I'm using parts of those skills, parts of that learning in every single interaction that I have. And I think that's allowed me the headspace to step back in a professional capacity to think about actually, I could be the person that holds that space for others. And that's where, to get round to your answering your question, but I did want to give it a bit of an understanding that there is a process.
Yeah.
The process doesn't fit everything, and you can pick and choose wherever you are on the process to help navigate that way forward. However, what I'd love to do is take you through the different stages that I use, and that you're doing that on the understanding that it doesn't need to be linear,
Yeah.
and that I will try and make reference to the formal mediation process, but also highlight that when I'm trying to get my kids out the door in the school in the morning, I will be using another part of the process. And I think that's where I find the joy in being able to navigate a way forward. And rather trying to say one size fits all, this guy's got all the answers. I don't have any of the answers, but I do have the time. I do have the space. I do have the conditions that it can enable others for themselves and those with whom they're in conflict in to find a better way forward than they currently face.
Brilliant. I love the
So
sound of that. So, this is this podcast called The Agile Speaker. And what you're just saying there really makes me feel about having that agility, isn't it? To be able to pick the right tools for the job that you're in, whether it's getting the kids to school or doing something with a colleague or family member or whatever it is, but having those tools that you can say, this is what I need right now. It's not necessarily the whole process, but it might be two or three parts of it.
and if you're following a process, very often you're reacting to what is the next step.
Yeah.
But if you're choosing how you respond, and I've made a choice, I'll back myself. I'll hold my ground better than I can do. When I'm not sure or I feel anxious, I want people to like me. That is my vulnerability. Okay. And I have worked really, really hard. I think it's why I'm drawn into the profession that I'm privileged to be part of, is by recognizing that I
Mm,
know I need to prepare well. I know I need to get the choices that are available to me. And then when I've made the choice, I can enjoy running with the ball. And I
yeah.
think that's reframing what you've just said. Again, another key skill in the kind of mediation process. And just to start with step one of
Okay.
the process. And again, I have introduced this almost in an approach to kind of formal mediation, but I hope that you're able to listen to this and wherever you might be with conflict, that this has some kind of resonance, some
Mm,
kind of connection for you that you can take away with you. And that when you finish listening to this podcast, you feel there's been a return in the investment of my time.
yeah.
Okay. And I think the first stage is all about the preparation. And I sound like I'm repeating myself, but I don't think, these things can be won or lost in how you prepare. And
Mm,
what I mean by that is that if you're in a conflict situation, and this is me as the mediator, I would be speaking with party A and party B. Okay. Ideally, I would like to do that with parties in the same room. Sometimes that is not possible, but actually, what the process I would follow at that preparation stage is always the same, in that ultimately you're doing everything you can to make them feel safe. And that sounds like a bit of the opposite of what they might be feeling, because
Mm.
they've come to you because this is something that they're struggling to try and resolve themselves. And in a professional sense, there can very often be lawyers in the room. So that makes you sort of on high alert kind of already. Or within a family kind of relationship, if it's been sort of around for a while, that means it's possibly been avoided, or there's just been, as I've said earlier, social hand grenade throwing competition, and people aren't feeling great at this point. And so it's really important that you set the tone around what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And that's again around helping people to navigate their boundaries. I hope that what you're hearing is not rocket science to you, because I'm pretty sure that you would do a lot of this anyway. But if we're able to do it under the understanding that we have conflict and this is helping resolve conflict, I think this is so, so important. And
Yeah.
what I mean by being safe, in terms of whether it be what the seating arrangement is like, whether it be what the timing is available. So people are able to know a lot of the unknowns, and being able to also have a falling out strategy. If you need 5 minutes, it's
Yeah.
okay to call it. If you need that time, and also asking them a few questions around what would it take for you to feel okay.
Yeah.
Very often when we're looking at conflict, we're looking about making sure our story is straight and all the blows or the kind of the impact of what the conflict has had of us is reported on. We don't spend enough time looking at what would good look like. How can this be better? Now,
Yeah.
I'm moving the process slightly sort of quickly there, but even just to throw that in as a seed in that preparation stage, so, so important. But
And what does that look like? So that I can see how that looks as a process when you're there as the mediator. But if it's more of a one-to-one between individuals, what does that look like?
well, I think actually, if and before it gets to mediation process, you would hope that that attempt has been made. But I still think you need to prepare. So
Mm.
both party A and party B, whether they be in a room, a coffee shop, or wherever that might be, that they're actually contracting around how are we going to find a way forward in terms of what are you like, what are the signals, what are the triggers that, make this difficult? What is the falling in approach in terms of when we be able to get that understanding? I cannot tell you when it's not a formal mediation, but
Mm.
you're able to offer or suggest someone, dare I say it, in a coaching conversation, what these approaches, and if they first person that and they choose how they're going to, it's really enabling and empowering because they go in with a kind of a chosen approach around how they might find, and there's always learning. I think that's really important. How a person responds to you having chosen approach, there's always learning about getting closer to the fact than making something up.
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of calling it.
Yeah.
Okay. And whether you're in a conflict or whether you're not in a conflict, I'm a big fan of the 24-hour rule. If something irritates you or you're not happy with something, call it. Okay. And actually being able to make sure that, because I think sometimes we can hold on to stuff, and to go back to someone and say, do you know when you said 3 months ago that you didn't like my shoes? That's pretty difficult to be able to come back from that. We can't change the past, but I do think the 24-hour rule is really, really helpful, whether that be family, whether that be work, just to be able to let people know, look, these are triggers for me. This is where conflict presents itself. And if we are an avoider, as Mary, you've said in episode 1 that you are, you know, that means that we let it build up, and then it becomes bigger than it actually needs to be. But
Yeah.
with that 24-hour rule and becoming an opportunity to be able to say what you really feel, you're actually valuing yourself. You're actually saying, you know what, I'm here, because we can spend a lot of time kind of in conflict worrying about what the other side thinks.
Mm.
I've spent a long time there talking about the preparation, but I've done that deliberately because I think that's so, so important. And
Yeah.
whether you're in conflict without a mediator, still prepare along the same sort of headings or lines as I've just kind of given in my breakdown there.
Yeah.
I
Because I
then,
can see how, even if it's in a conversation. So going back to the example I gave earlier, I remember when I ended up having to leave a voicemail about the issue that it was about. But I remember I set out the goal of the conversation at the very start, and that set the tone set the point of discussion so it's absolutely clear what we were talking about, and with no real emotion connected to it at all. But I suppose it was just in a one-to-one with another individual, setting out the kind of ground rules. It's just setting out is that the right word to use?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
In a mediation, you
Yeah.
would talk about setting the ground rules.
Yeah. And it
And
does just give
yeah,
absolute clarity to everybody
yeah.
where everybody is, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And I can see how that might then make you feel more comfortable in then getting into a discussion because you feel like everybody's on a level playing field. Yeah.
And having experienced, one of your training workshops, that's what you encourage us to do in communication.
Mm.
Be really clear with the purpose, and if emotion is helpful, use it. But if it's not helpful, don't use it.
Yeah.
And I think very often at the early stages, when people are coming into a room or you're one on one with someone that you're in conflict with, just being really upfront, really clear, without the emotion, that can come. But actually naming, this is a purpose why we're here. And the intention or the hope of being here is to find a way forward that both parties feel that they can walk out of the room
Yeah.
with understanding, feeling that means that they can get on with the rest of their lives.
And just to go back, you talked about the 24-hour rule. So what exactly are we talking about there? Is that if somebody, as you say, social hand grenade or something happens, and are you saying call it out within a day to
The
say whether it was an inappropriate thing to do, or what
I mean,
exactly is that?
I've found it to be a healthy tool of being able to let someone know within 24 hours if they've done something that you disagree with. Now, I think we've got to be really clear that we've been talking about the process of a formal mediation and being agile to use that in a conflict situation. I do think that if you're in a place or a room where you are working well with people, in the same way that I talk about having a falling in strategy, one
Mm.
of the approaches of a falling in strategy is say, look, if anything gets difficult or if I do something that is not going to work for you, please, can I give you 24 hours to let me know? And
Yeah.
just, it's a bit like giving a person your trust, and when it comes to conflict, trust is very often the last thing on the page. And that is got a choice of whether that's completely ruined or whether that's rebuilt or whether that's just we've got to work together, so we're going to manage it as best we can. But
Mm.
I do think that what you're offering in terms of being able to recognize that conflict is part language, it's not all of us, and that we do have lives that don't have conflict in it, and
Mm.
being able to have tools that can work in both the non-conflict part and the conflict.
Great. Okay. What's the next step? Step two.
That would be almost taking people through, developing and framing interest. I am an advocate of a fan of having both parties in the room at this stage. There are some offerings that do this separately. Very often we can be in a room for a long time, and I like to take that into bite-sized chunks. So rather than trying to fix it all in a oneer, which sometimes we can put a lot of pressure on ourselves. Again, I'm talking about the formal mediation, but also if you're in one-on-one sort of discussion with someone, there can be a bit of a pressure to rush to fix or get to the solution. I would
Yeah.
suggest don't do that too quickly, and being able to give both sides the opportunity to feel like they've been heard, both sides to be able to frame in their words, their language. That's as big a clue to say, shut up, let them talk. Okay.
Mm.
I've got a phrase where you let them be sick on the table, blah, get it out. But you've got to contract that. You've got to frame it and be really, really clear where the beginning and the middle of the end is of that. Because if you're busy or you're interrupted or another email comes in and you knock that halfway through, I mean, already I'm feeling the impact of how I would feel if that was me on the other side. And
Mm.
because we lead very, very busy lives, sometimes typically in a supervision situation, for example, people can be making a choice in the moment, but actually what they're telling the person that they're meant to be supervising or having a courageous conversation or a conflict conversation with is, I value the other thing more than I value this. And that is really hard to pull back from. You really need to sort of reset. But by being able to take that developing and almost framing kind of uh, the situation, framing the circumstances, what has happened, and that's a bit like the positions and
Yeah.
interest exercise. But to be able to do that in a facilitated way, where there's a non-judgmental approach, deeply, deeply confidential, where people know that they are not going to hear this, in the corridor. Or I think that's really, really important. Any conversation that is clearly contracted,
Yeah.
because what people can find is by being sick on the table and having been heard purely as the priority does give an opening for them to think about, consider what letting go or a next step might be. But you've really got to be careful in reading. Don't rush that. And you've got to
Mm.
go with everyone in the room rather than those that you just because you think you've got to follow a process and this is the next step. There is nothing worse than missing the audience because you think you're following the next step and
Yeah.
you're right. I
Yeah.
don't believe you are. I think it's about really important about checking in with people. Is there anything else? Is there anything else that, you need to think about? You need to kind of share. Is there anything that would make you feel better by way of knowing?
Hmm.
And actually, there is, people in conflict are tense, they are tight. The
Yeah.
gift of the mediator, the gift of the person that's trying to get the other person to talk is let them drop their shoulders a bit and
Yeah.
feel a bit more kind of true and connected to themselves. And
And
that's a skill.
how do you so again, I'm thinking about the one-to-one situation as well, where there isn't necessarily a mediator involved. What are there questioning techniques you use, or are there stepping stones of questions that you would use, presumably open questions to get people talking?
Uh, Again, being in the kind of coaching field, the textbook answer is to ask the five questions of who, what, why, when,
Hmm.
kind of how. But asking open questions really, really important. And I think I was guilty of very often, because I would have the answer in my head, I would ask a closed question. So anything that's got yes or no might not be the most helpful question. Okay,
Yeah.
so that would be how I would define a kind of a closed question. I am a big fan of making sure that you are not directing that part of the process. And when I say directing, directing the questioning of that part of the process in terms of what do you think? What has happened? And you're really exploring. I think we make your kind of contribution earlier very helpful in that we can make judgments too quickly. I
Mm.
think you have a gift as the asker of the question to make sure that we're not judging, we're just making sure that we're getting the facts out.
Yeah.
However, you might need to also hold in the same hand that there's a lot of emotion associated with this. And in your questioning, being able to work out what is fact and what is emotion,
Yeah.
that can
And
be
what?
quite revealing for people and saying, actually, I can park that and recognize that's how I feel, but this is actually what's happened. And this is why it's bothering me so much. And this is eventually getting to a place where, we can honestly and openly have our shoulders dropped and be able to think, do you know what, to move forward, I could consider this,
Yeah.
but you don't want to rush that. And so I think keep the opening questions to make sure they've been sick on the table.
Yeah.
And, very often if I'm not sure what to say, um, silence is very, very powerful. And actually just being able to hold that space and that I'm also because we live in a society where sometimes we're encouraged not to share our emotions. I
Mm.
would be looking to make sure that, if there was to be a few tears and a bit of emotion, that I would welcome that.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's letting the human be in the room rather than the job title. Now, that can be whether you're a mum, dad, brother, sister. That could be whether you're a managing director, a chief executive, or whether you're the newest joined employee.
Yeah.
We've all got emotions, and I think just what you're doing is creating a time and space where it's okay to be you. And sometimes a few bloodies or a kick the budgie can be helpful.
And you also talked about so developing and framing interests. You want to understand what matters to everybody because what matters to one person hugely might matter far less for somebody else. You know, what value do people put on the concerns that are being discussed? So I suppose that's another aspect that it's useful to really understand. So, something I've talked about in negotiation skills is how, you know, a glass of water to a person standing in the desert is going to be way more valuable to somebody who's standing in an office next to a water cooler. It's that sort of what really matters, what's valuable to people. And it's very easy to make assumptions about that, isn't it? Based on your own interests.
And, this could also be called preparing for a presentation.
Yeah.
By framing use interest, as you've just so beautifully described. I can't do it any better, or just sort of really add my own kind of experience and thoughts, in that regard. But if you were in a mediation, you would spend time with party A, letting them be sick on the table, forgive the phrase,
Yeah.
and then you would go and meet with party B, letting them be sick on the table. If it's one-on-one, you're being able to contract that that's the purpose of that stage of the conversation.
Mm,
And once both parties feel that they've been heard and their voice is out there, then and only then would I be suggesting that you're kind of framing the interests as you describe and what's important. And that is a bit like preparing for a presentation.
mm,
You do the work to be able to think about, forgive me, what are the 3 points to take home with you? What are the things that really need to kind of get across?
mm.
And it's really helpful sometimes within a mediation space. People have spent so much time being defined by the part where you're getting them to be sick on the table that they don't allow themselves permission to be able to think about, well, actually, how can I move on this? Or what would allow me to be able to think about something else?
Yeah.
Because this is the stuff that eats you away. This is the stuff that has a physiological impact on our health and well-being.
Hmm.
If we just live by labels, we miss this opportunity to be able to think about, okay, we've shared the information, but what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
And I think this is a key part in the process in terms of what are we going to do about it? And,
Yeah.
that's not getting to the solution just yet. That's just you getting out first person in terms of to move forward or to be able to, what's important to me, till you've revisited that, at the beginning of the kind of the conversation, you've heard where the conflict is and might be. And then ultimately you're in a place where you're hoping that the party has got their hands on the steering wheel for driving this. If
Yeah.
it was HR, it would be a different process and someone else that would be making a decision at this point. And I think this is the gift of a conflict resolution, whether that be a conversation between two individuals or whether it be a mediation that needs a third party to come and help navigate that, where people are able to say, do you know what? Having downloaded and having given a real kind of clear and thoughtful insight in terms of where I'm at, with all the emotion, you're able to take a kind of a head up. And that if I needed to go and speak to someone who is not in the room and actually think about where could be the steps forward on this, and
Hmm.
please take note of the words steps, because we don't want to rush that too quickly
Yeah.
and start to get people to agree to something that they've not. There's nothing worse than agreeing to something than waking up the next morning and saying, if only.
Yeah.
So
Because
if
we
I
had
had,
discussed another whole aspect, and yeah, it's that feeling of wanting to rush to get the deal done, isn't
yeah,
it?
yeah. And I think that's where, there's about developing interest and then there's framing interests.
Yeah.
And I think the turnkey between those is in the facilitator or the person having the conversation's gift around when the right time is. And
Yeah.
I would offer encourage that you contract that rather than assume that, and
Yeah.
don't make any assumptions, but checking in. That's a great way of making people feel safe. And again, I've said this before, but coming back to it in this stage, don't be afraid of the silence. People need time to process.
Yeah.
People need time to think.
Yeah.
And so if you've got a 2 hour room booked for a meeting and you're running out of time, I would make sure that you very quickly have the plan that makes sure that things aren't completely kind of cut or stopped, because that is a critical point where someone is feeling listened to, where
Yeah.
they're feeling valued and they have a sense of belonging. So they're able to kind of move to the next phase, which having framed, developed the interest, you framed, what potential outcomes, potential approaches might be. And again, your line of questioning is possibly getting a bit more specific now because you've heard where people are at. And
Mhm.
also, you would get a read in terms of, are people ready for that? And I would offer encourage, if they're not ready for it, it's okay to say, can we come back and revisit this? And I think that's just as important in a formal mediation as it is in two people having a conversation around whatever's happened at Christmas. Forgive me, we
So
keep going back to that, but it's just really, really important that do we need to take a breather?
yeah, I was just going to say, so you mean
Yeah,
taking a break and just saying, I just need to process what's just,
yeah.
yeah.
And I've found in my personal experience in delivering this professionally, by doing this over, being open, people being open to be able to do this over a 3, possibly 4 week period. That's very helpful, because usually when you're in a room and you're trying to do everything, it can be very focused and quite tense. And your skill is to try and navigate people to get to a better place. And there are times, approaches I find when that is appropriate. However, when it's about relationships, and I've focused predominantly on kind of workplace disputes, I have found it incredibly helpful when you're able to revisit something over a longer period of time. And by this point, what typically happens is both parties are coming to you because they've had a couple of nights sleep. They've been able to sleep better because they've been able to tell exactly where they're at, and they're able to think about actually what needs to happen to move this forward. The
Yeah.
same could be said within family situations, where we've got lots of choices now in terms of how we I've found navigating COVID particular challenge very quickly, being able to try and develop these skills kind of online. They are more transactional, but if it's all you've got and you live in a different part from a person, as long as you've got the contracting right and doing that really, really well, and that you're revisiting it at an agreed time rather than just as and when,
Mm.
by this point in the process, I find that people are coming to you owning for themselves, which for me is when the magic and the light can come on for them, rather than, as I described at the beginning of my answer around professionally. Step 3 is framing interests.
Okay, perfect. And then what's step 4?
Step 4 is what we would call the resolution agreement. And that would be where both parties would be presented with understanding the outcomes and how things are going to move forward. That's very formal and works in a professional situation, and it might not be appropriate within a family dynamic. But this would, I think, if I was to offer from my experience, it is helpful to write it down somewhere and just to be able to have a kind of a record that this has happened.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we get to this point and everyone is kind of feeling a bit more hopeful or a bit better, if there is resolution, dare I say it, there are times when there is no resolution, and you recognize that, but almost just putting a date and a time that an attempt was either made, or a
Yeah.
date and a time, and there was actually an understanding, this is how we're going to kind of move forward.
Yeah.
And no bad time also to introduce the 24-hour example then, because you never know, it can represent itself, and
Yeah.
have you got a process and understanding by which how you're going to navigate that. But I would encourage you, by doing once, you've got a bit of muscle, and there's muscle memory for this process, and that can be very, very helpful to turn to, and people know and understand that should conflict present itself, we've found a way forward that works for us.
Having it written down is so key, isn't it? Because that really does give your commitment to what you've discussed. Brilliant. Okay, Drew, thank you so much. So you've taken us through those 4 steps on how to handle conflict, and I can really see brilliant when you get that simple, straightforward roadmap, and when something that can be so emotionally tied and maybe be anxious for people having those steps is a really great thing to just hold on to, isn't it? To think, have I done this bit? Have I done that bit? Or even I've done it, but actually, have I really fulfilled what I should have done there? Have I asked all the right questions? Because maybe it also helps you to see if you haven't quite fulfilled a step, because maybe something's gone wrong somewhere along the way. So it gives you something to come back to, doesn't it? That route map.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, again, there's a real similarity to your presentation skills
Yeah.
here. And actually, this is doing the thing well and being able to recognize, actually, I could revisit that and do that differently, or actually being able to make sure you have a record of it. And
Mm.
that kind of, even in the delivery of the message, there's also the delivery of the resolution.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that we can sometimes do too quickly. And I
Yeah.
would offer and encourage, when it comes to conflict, do the work,
Yeah.
do the work. And I think good things can and do happen.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much, Drew. Again, really great steps for people to be able to take away and to remember around when dealing with conflict. In the next episode, we're going to talk about self-care during conflict. So, really being aware of how you're feeling and things to consider that may not be visible to others, but you may be experiencing yourself. Thank you so much for listening to season 6 of The Agile Speaker. We are planning a bonus episode at the end of the series where we'll do a Q&A with questions from you, our listeners. If you have any questions you'd like to put to us, please drop me an email at mj@Maryanne, Maryanne, Johnston, johnston.co.uk. If you'd like to learn more about Drew and his work, head to www.drummondinternational.com. And if you'd like to hear more about my work and tap into our resources around becoming a more relaxed presenter, head to www.maryannejohnston.co.uk.